There's a card in the game called Gizmek, the Festive Fox of Fecundity, which has the effect to special summon a monster from the deck that has an attack that's equal to its own defense. So, in this list, we're going to be going over monsters that have attacks that are equal to their own defense, which might be a target for this one card. And at number 10, we have Gizmek Orochi, the Serpentron Sky Slasher. This is a lovely monster that has two effects, where, if this card is in your hand or graveyard, you can banish the top 8 cards of your deck face down in order to special summon this card. And also, you can banish 3 cards from your extra deck face down in order to destroy one face-up monster on the field. However, both of its effects share a hard once per turn. So you can't both use its effect to special summon itself and then use its other effect to destroy a card in the same turn. However, its effect to special summon itself is a quick effect, so you can just bring out this card during your opponent's end phase in order to have its destruction effect alive as soon as your turn starts, which was usually how the card was used the most. And since it was a high-level monster that could both special summon itself rather generically and destroy cards rather generically, it was actually used in a whole bunch of different kinds of decks. Most notably Grand Maju decks, since those decks are all about banishing a whole bunch of cards in order to have a giant beatstick. But it was useful in other non-Grand Maju decks as well, because the card has the wonderful distinction of being able to special summon itself from the graveyard. Most cards that special summon themselves from the graveyard have some kind of clause which makes it so they can't do the effect again. Like Destiny Hero Malicious requires you to banish other copies of itself, so it's inherently limited to how many times you can do that per duel by the amount of copies of the card you have. Cards like Plague Spreader Zombie banish themselves after they activate their effect to special summon from the graveyard. Gizmek Orochi doesn't do any of these things. Just as long as you have cards in your deck to banish, you can special summon it, pretty much every turn. Although banishing 8 cards is kind of steep if you're using the effect over and over. So it kind of has a soft limit on how many times you can bring it out, but you could still definitely reuse the same card more than once without worrying about decking yourself out. And Gizmek Orochi belongs to the Gizmek archetype, which is an archetype mainly machine monsters which have the distinction that all of their attacks are equal to their own defense. Just like Gizmek, the card that kind of inspired the idea behind this list. And at number 9, we have the Barrier Statue of the Torrent. Now, technically, all barrier statues make the number 9 spot, since they all literally do the exact same thing, just with different types and attributes. Each barrier statue has the effect where neither player can special summon monsters except a monster that shares the same attribute as the barrier statue. And all barrier statues have 1000 attack and defense. Now, Barrier Statue of the Torrent has seen a long history of competitive play, thanks to the fact that the water attribute monsters aren't a very meta type of attribute. So, if you summon a Barrier Statue of the Torrent, there's a good chance you're going to lock your opponent out of special summoning all of their monsters. And there have also been some really good rogue decks that are pure water, like Paleozoic Frogs, which can easily supplement a Barrier Statue of the Torrent in order to lock down their opponent, without hampering their own plays at all. Because the ability to stop your opponent from special summoning monsters is one of the strongest floodgates you can have. Barrier Statue of the Torrent also saw some niche play with Gizmek, the Festive Fox of Fecundity, as this card has the effect where if your opponent special summons a monster from their main deck, you can then special summon this card from your hand. And it also has the effect that, if this card is normal or special summoned, you can then target one face-up monster your opponent controls in order to special summon a monster from your hand or deck, who both is the same attribute as your opponent's monster, and has an attack which is equal to its own defense. Now on surface level, this effect seems pretty niche to actually see any competitive play, until you remember that Crystron Halqifibrax exists. Crystron Halqifibrax is a very powerful link monster which is responsible for a handful of cards being on the ban list, which has the effect that on summon, you get to special summon a tuner monster from your deck. And Crystron Halqifibrax is of the water attribute. So, if your opponent brings out a Crystron Halqifibrax and just uses effect to special summon a monster from their deck, that fulfills the conditions for Gizmek to special summon itself, then target Crystron Halqifibrax in order to special summon the Barrier Statue of the Torrent from your deck, which does an excellent job of just shutting down your opponent's plays for the turn. There's also a card called Simorgh, Bird of Sovereignty, which has the effect that during the end phase, you can special summon a winged beast monster from your hand or deck, who has a level that's lower than the total number of unused spell and trap card zones on the field. And with the number of spell/trap zones on the field being 10, there's a good chance there's going to be at least 4 of them unused, so you can bring out Barrier Statue of the Stormwind from your deck in order to lock your opponent out of non-wind monsters, which is another less popular attribute, which means you'll probably lock out your opponent of all of their monsters as well. Now, with how good the barrier statues are, you might think it's off that they're only the number 9 spot on this list. And that's mainly because they're very easy to destroy by battle, with them only having 1,000 attack and defense. So you usually have to expend resources in order to defend them, and generally it is worth trying to defend them, but most of the time they're only going to be locking your opponent out for 1 turn, and they rarely last around very long outside of very specific barrier statue stun decks, which kind of exist to try to make them stay around longer. And at number 8, we have Madolche Anjelly. This is a card with 1,000 attack and defense and is kind of responsible for the resurgence of Madolche decks in the rogue competitive scene, as basically, the entire deck used to revolve around this card to an extent. What this card does is you contribute this card in order to special summon any Madolche monster from your deck, and also that monster cannot be destroyed by battle, but gets shuffled back into your deck during the end phase of your next turn. What's notable about this effect is 2 things. For one, it allows you to special summon any Madolche monster from your deck, regardless of its level, so it's just the perfect starter card for all of their plays. And for 2, since it tributes itself in order to activate the effect, it does the ever-important thing of actually putting a monster card in your graveyard. Madolches have a gimmick where, whenever they're destroyed on the field, they're shuffled back into the deck instead of going to the graveyard. And some of their effects interact with Madolche monsters in the graveyard, like Madolche Hootcake. Madolche Hootcake has the effect where you can banish 1 monster from your graveyard in order to special summon 1 Madolche monster from your deck. And what do you know? Using Madolche Anjelly to bring out Hootcake just sets up its effect, in order to get out another Madolche monster from the deck. And this is kind of where the combos would start. And the next best card to summon was usually Madolche Mesengelato, since Mesengelato has the effect where, if this card is special summoned and you control a Madolche beast-type monster, then you get to add a Madolche spell or trap card from your deck to your hand, which Madolche Hootcake sets up, since it both special summons the card and is a beast-type Madolche monster. And then there was a whole bunch of other things you could do after this point, depending on the state of the board and hand, and what other cards you had on the field. Like if you were able to open up with Madolche Mufule in order to have another card on the field. Now, the original wave of Madolche cards were released in late 2012, and didn't really see much competitive play, even though they had a really banger of a boss monster in the form of Madolche Queen Tiramisu. Because that card could return 2 cards in the field back to the deck without targeting either of them, which is still a really good effect even in the modern day. They just didn't really have a good combo starter until Madolche Anjelly was released a year and a half later, in May 2014. Madolche Anjelly is kind of like the Chamber Dragon Maid of the Madolche deck. It was released after the first wave of support in order to help the archetype because it wasn't doing good enough on its own. And now the archetype is almost completely reliant on it. And at number 7, we have Card Trooper. This is a level 3 monster with 400 attack and defense, and has the effect where you can send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard in order to increase this card's attack by 500 for each card sent until the end of the turn. So, a Card Trooper can get itself up to 1900 attack for a turn, which made it a pretty decent beatstick. Although this card was released in 2007, after the era of 1900 beatsticks being meta relevant. It's still always good to have a 1900 attack beatstick though, and what really set Card Trooper apart and allowed it to see a whole bunch of competitive play almost immediately was the fact that it's a machine-type monster with less than 500 attack, which means it's a target for machine duplication. Machine duplication allows you to special summon 2 other monsters from your deck that share the same name, as a machine-type monster you control with 500 or less attack. So, if you brought out a Card Trooper and then brought out 2 others from the deck, you could mill 9 cards into the graveyard while also having 3 1900 attack beatsticks on the field, in addition to the fact that Card Trooper also allowed you to draw a card when it was destroyed. So, not only is being able to mill 9 cards for a 2-card combo really good, being able to draw 3 cards afterwards is even better. This was immediately played in decks like Bazoo Return, which would use cards like Bazoo the Soul Eater in order to banish cards from the graveyard, and Return from Different Dimension in order to special summon all those monsters. And the Card Trooper combo was just using a whole bunch of other decks that wanted cards in the graveyard, and in fact was so good and gave so much advantage that Card Trooper itself eventually got limited on the ban list. That way you could no longer use it with machine duplication at all, and it basically stayed semi-limited or limited on the ban list for almost all of its life in the game, only coming off in recent years because it's no longer a big deal in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 6, we have Performage Hat Tricker. This is a monster with 1100 attack and defense, which has the effect that if there are 2 more monsters in the field, you can special summon this card from your hand. Now, what's unique about Hat Tricker's effect is the fact that it's a level 4 monster that can special summon itself from the hand, which is almost always valuable. The thing that makes Hat Tricker even more valuable than normal is the fact that its condition for special summon itself is an already established board, where usually it's the opposite. There's tons of cards like Photon Thrasher, which are level 4 monsters that can special summon themselves from the hand, as long as you don't have any other monsters on your side of the field. In fact, that's kind of the default effect for level 4 monsters that can special summon themselves from the hand. And the reason they have this effect is so that you can't spit out every card in your hand on the field immediately on your first turn. Performage Hat Tricker can be used exactly like that though, because its effect is not once per turn to special summon itself from the hand either. And it also belongs to a really good archetype support, as it can be searched out with Performage Damage Juggler, who's able to search the card out with its graveyard effect. So if the card is just milled in a normal mill deck, you can then use Performage Damage Juggler's effect in the graveyard to gain advantage, with Performage Hat Tricker being added to your hand, or just Performage Trick Clown, which is another excellent target. So Performage Hat Tricker has seen a whole bunch of play over the years because it's very useful. And that's partly because of the fact that it has really good support cards as well, that are usually played alongside it as a mini-engine, even though Performage Hat Tricker doesn't need the other cards at all in order to be used to its full advantage. The card also has an additional effect on the field, although this kind of falls into the category of one of those niche secondary effects that no one really knows about because it's never used. But its second effect is, if a card or effect is activated which would inflict damage to you, you can place one Performage counter on this card in order to make the effect damage become 0. Then, once this card has 3 Performage counters on it, its attack and defense becomes 3300, which is just a neat bonus effect, where usually the card is used as material as soon as it hits the field and doesn't really have time to accumulate 3 counters. And at number 5, we have Batteryman Solar. This is a level 4 monster with 1500 attack and defense, and is basically the main combo starter of the Thunder Dragon decks. As this card has the effect that, when this card is summoned, you can send a Thunder monster from your deck to the graveyard. And also, if another Thunder monster is summoned while this card's on the field, you get to special summon a level 1 Batteryman token. So Batteryman Solar can be used in order to get a Thunder Dragon monster in the graveyard, that way the effect of a Thunder Dragon Hawk is live in order to special summon something immediately with its hand effect. Then as soon as you get another Thunder monster on the field, Batteryman Solar is going to produce a token, which can then be used for all kinds of combo plays, like being converted into an effect monster with Link Karibo, or just being used as material for some summer summoner. So Battery Solar is basically an Armageddon Knight for the archetype, which also allows you to go +1 with the token generation effect, which makes it very valuable in the Thunder Dragon deck, and is one of the few non-Thunder Dragon cards they play outside of hand traps. And because Thunder Dragons have seen so much competitive play over the years before the banning of Thunder Dragon Colossus, Batteryman Solar gets a high spot on this list. Which is funny because this card is actually meant for the Batteryman archetype. It's just Thunder Dragons were way better, and it functions so well in Thunder Dragons that it might as well have been a Thunder Dragon monster. And at number 4, we have SPYRAL Gear Drone. This is a level 1 monster with 100 attack and defense, and has the effect that, when it's summoned, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. Then place them on top of their deck in any order. Now, normally this effect is not good. However, spirals have a little gimmick, where a lot of their effects require you to guess the top card of your opponent's deck correctly in order to resolve some of their effects, like Spiral Super Agent and Spiral Double Helix, 2 of the most important cards of the archetype. However, if that's all SPYRAL Gear Drone did, it wouldn't be on this list. It also has the effect where, if this card's in your graveyard, you can banish this card and 1 Spiral card in order to add a Spiral Super Agent from your graveyard to your hand. In addition to having a quick effect on the field to tribute itself to increase the attack of one of your Spiral monsters by 500 for each card your opponent controls, which is a permanent attack boost. Now individually, all 3 of these effects are somewhat minor, however, they all function extremely well within the Spiral archetype, especially since SPYRAL Gear Drone shares the same distinction as Card Trooper, in being a machine type monster with less than 500 attack. So you can actually special summon 2 other copies of SPYRAL Gear Drone from your deck with machine duplication, and none of its effects are once per turn. So if you had 3 SPYRAL Gear Drones in your graveyard, then you can use all 3 of their effects as long as you meet the conditions to activate them. So the card was absolutely a key component of Spiral decks, which had a whole bunch of other overpowered cards like Spiral Master Plan, Spiral Quick Fix, and Spiral Resort, which is why spirals are one of the few tier 0 cards in the game's history. And even SPYRAL Gear Drone saw its place in the ban list for a while, being limited to 1 copy so you couldn't use it with machine duplication. Although funny enough, SPYRAL Gear Drone wasn't even the best target to use machine duplication on in the deck. That was actually Spiral Quick Fix. Although Spiral Quick Fix's attack is not equal to its defense, so it's not worth a mention on this list. And at number 3, we have Babycerasaurus. This is a level 2 dinosaur monster with 500 attack and defense, and also has the effect that, if it's destroyed by a card effect and sent to the graveyard, you get to special summon a level 4 or lower dinosaur type monster from your deck. And dinosaur type monsters love to destroy their own cards to activate their effects, thanks to things like Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, Soul Eating Oviraptor, or their field spell card Lost World. And since two of the best cards within dinosaur decks are Ultimate Conductor Tyranno and Soul Eating Oviraptor, Babycerasaurus is just kind of the bread and butter of their destruction targets. Ultimate Conductor Tyranno has a quick effect where it can flip all of your opponent's cards face down, but requires you to destroy a monster on the field or in your hand in order to activate its effect, which allows you to special summon a monster from your deck if you target Babycerasaurus. Soul Eating Oviraptor has the effect to special summon a dinosaur type monster from your graveyard, but it has to destroy a level 4 or lower dinosaur type monster in the field in order to activate its effect, which turns into a monster from the deck if your target is Babycerasaurus. When dinosaur decks used to run True King Lithoslegim the Disaster, its effect to special summon itself from the hand was to destroy 2 other earth monsters in your hand or the field, which turned into a monster from your deck if one of your targets was Babycerasaurus. Babycerasaurus is one of those cards in the deck which basically turns the cost of a lot of the dinosaur cards into a special summon of a monster from the deck, which is why the card has seen all kinds of competitive play ever since these 2 cards came out. As before these 2 cards came out, it almost never saw any competitive play because dinosaur decks as a whole just weren't very good outside of Dino Rabbit. And at number 2, we have Sky Striker Ace Raye. This is a level 4 monster with 1500 attack and defense and has the quick effect on the field where you can tribute this card in order to special summon a Sky Striker Ace monster from your extra deck to the extra monster zone. And since half of the Sky Striker Ace monsters are link monsters which have effects that activate when they're summoned, this basically allows you to tag out into all the extra deck cards in order to use their effects during your opponent's turn. Like Sky Striker Ace Kaina in order to stop one of your opponent's monsters from attacking, Sky Striker Ace Shizuku in order to add a card from your deck to your hand, or Sky Striker Ace Kagari in order to add a card from your graveyard to your hand. And Sky Striker Ace Raye has another effect, where if this card's in your graveyard, and whenever a Sky Striker Ace Link monster is destroyed by battle, or is removed from the field by an opponent's card effect, aka no matter what your opponent does, you get to activate this graveyard effect, you can then special summon this card from the graveyard. Now, the only restriction this card has is that you can only use each of its effects once per turn, which means every turn its effect to special himself from the graveyard is live. So, you get a lot of mileage off of a single Sky Striker Ace Raye. And I think that's kind of the whole intent of the card, as it was the only main deck monster the Sky Strikers had until Sky Striker Ace Rose was released a year and a half later after Raye. So, if you had a single Sky Striker Ace monster on your side of the field, and your opponent removed them in some way, then you could float into a Sky Striker Ace Raye from the graveyard, who could then immediately tribute itself in order to special summon another Sky Striker Ace monster from your extra deck. And this kind of gave the deck some monster board presence, because their whole gimmick was not having any monsters in the main monster zones in order to activate their spell cards. And it did a really good job of that, as the Sky Striker archetype saw all kinds of competitive play when it first came out, and then immediately started seeing competitive play again once their main combo searcher was released from the ban list. And Sky Striker Ace Raye just coincidentally has an attack which equals its defense, and was basically the only main deck non-hand trap monster within Sky Strikers. So it takes a really high spot in this list with a whole bunch of other heavy hitters that saw tons of competitive play, like Babycerasaurus or Batteryman Solar. And at number 1, we have DD Crow. This is a hand trap with 100 attack and defense and has the effect where you can discard this card from your hand in order to target one card in your opponent's graveyard in order to banish that target. So basically, if your opponent is using some kind of effect which targets a card in the graveyard on its activation, like Monster Reborn, you can then chain DD Crow in your hand to the activation of the card in order to remove it from the graveyard. That way the effect fizzles out and doesn't actually resolve, which causes them to waste the card in most cases, as Monster Reborn will go to the graveyard without special summoning any monster. And since so many cards in the game like to bring cards out of the graveyard, like Sky Striker Ace Kagari or SPYRAL Gear Drone, DD Crow is just a very useful hand trap against a whole bunch of meta decks, and was also one of the first modern hand traps to ever be released, coming out in 2007, 3 years before Effect Veiler came out in 2010, which is another one of the most used hand traps in the game's history. In fact, DD Crow might be the first ever hand trap that saw widespread competitive play, as it was used as soon as it came out, as even back in 2007, there were archetypes that liked to interact with their graveyard in order to do things. Funny enough, there is another hand trap which accomplishes a similar feat to DD Crow, which also has an attack which is equal to its defense. Ally of Justice Cycle Reader is a level 3 tuner monster with 1000 attack and defense, and has the effect where, as a quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to banish 2 light monsters from your opponent's graveyard. So its effect is exactly like DD Crow, except it only targets light monsters instead of just any card. But since it targets 2 monsters instead of 1, it has seen a lot of play over the years whenever there's a meta deck that has a whole bunch of light monsters that like to use the graveyard, like Drytrons. Now, I wouldn't exactly equate Ally of Justice Cycle Reader to the same level of importance as DD Crow, but it is kind of hilarious that they both do kind of the same thing, and they both have seen a ton of competitive play in the past, and also have an attack which is equal to their defense. Alright, and that's the list. I should mention that I left out a whole bunch of cards from this video, because originally I only wanted targets which could be searched out with Gizmek the festive fox of fecundity. So I left out all extra deck monsters that might meet the criteria, like Thunder Dragon Titan. I also left off all the monsters that have 0 attack and defense, like Droll and Lockbird, since I felt like that was cheating. And I left off all the banned monsters like Masterpiece the True Draco Slaying King, who has 2950 attack and defense. And also, I left out Destiny Hero Malicious because it's on my internal ban list of cards I'm not allowed to talk about in videos anymore, as that card has 800 attack and defense.